just going to use an old drawing on thick paper. We can just use a piece of cardboard or anything they have lying around. I'm going to make some stencils using some leaves that I found that I quite like the shape of. So all you do for this is just flatten down the leaf as best you can and draw around it like so. Doesn't have to be perfect. And then you do the same for the other leaf. You don't have to use leaves, you could use any shape that you wanted. You could just make random shapes if you liked, or circles or hearts, but I quite like the natural effect of the leaves, the organic shapes. So once you've got your leaf shapes, you just need to cut them out. So there you have it. There's my 2 leaf shapes. Then you're going to get some watercolour paper. It can be watercolour or it can be like a mixed media paper, or any paper that's thick enough really and has a porous enough surface for watercolour paints. You could also use gouache or acrylic paints if you wanted to, or even pencil crayons, but I find that watercolour works best. So to start off, you're going to get your paper. Mine's just watercolour paper. I think it was probably from the Works, so it doesn't have to be expensive, but you just want it to be nice and thick and able to carry the water. So to start off with, we're going to make a background. So I'm going to use and what we want to do is we want to start off with the lightest colours, and then we're going to, as the layers develop, we're going to add darker and darker colours. So you want a really light base. So to start with, I'm going to do a mix up a yellow colour and some white in there, and just cover the whole of the paper in a very thin light wash of watercolours. It's got, make sure that all your paper is wet. Okay, remove any hairs. And then at this stage, today I'm going to use, this is called brusho. It's almost like a powdered watercolour. You don't have to use this, but this is what I'm going to use for my background to make an interesting design. So I'm just going to use a lightish colour. I'm going to go for a yellow. So this paper is quite porous and has soaked up the water already, so I'm just going to add a bit more water to my surface. And then I'm just going to use a tiny amount of brusho. So it's a powder like this. I'm going to put a tiny amount on a dry brush. And I'm just going to sprinkle it on very lightly. And as the brusho interacts with the wet paper, it should make some interesting patterns. So now that that's done, we're going to leave that to dry and then come back to do the next layer. So now that's dry, we're going to start with our first layer. So these leaves are going to be in the foreground of your image, and these are the leaves that are going to be yellow, because we're actually going to be painting the negative space around the shape rather than the center. So for these leaves, these will be the yellow leaves at the foreground of the painting, or your shapes, whatever shape you have chosen for this project. So I would use a fairly light pencil, and as lightly as you can, you place your leaves template wherever you'd like it, and as lightly as you can, just draw around the outline. So you want it to press lightly enough that it can not be seen when you finish the painting, but heavily enough so that you can actually see what you're doing, because this marks out where you've got to paint around. So draw all the way around your leaf. And then you want to do this, these images, if possible, to not overlap with each other. So I'm going to draw another one of these here. And of course you can flip the stencil around the opposite way to give a mirror image. So this actually gives the effect that you've got more different types of leaves. Press a little bit too hard there. So yeah, just make sure you press as lightly as you can. You can obviously do this on a larger piece of paper or a smaller piece of paper, depending on the size of your project. So I'm going to do my other leaf here. Don't worry if it's not perfect. Nothing in nature is perfectly symmetrical anyway. So press very lightly there. I don't know if you can see any of these. And again, make sure that they're not crossing over with the other stencils you've drawn round. So I'm going to start off with 4. So 2 of each leaf to begin with. Okay, so now we are going to, actually I might put half of the leaf so that the stencil is actually hanging off the edge, just to give that more of a natural effect. And So you've just got to remember that this first layer will be your background colour. So start off like that. So once you've got your pencil drawings, I don't know if you can actually see my stencil lines there. We're going to start off painting around the outside of our stencil shapes, using a slightly darker colour than what we have here. So you can choose whatever colour you want, it doesn't matter, but start off with the lightest variation and then work towards the darkest variation. So all I'm going to do is use the yellow that I had mixed previously, and I'm going to mix in a little bit of green and a little bit of white paint. And again, you want to make sure that the paint's fairly liquid. And then we're just going to carefully paint around the outside of our stencil shapes. Like so. So once you've finished painting around the outside, you should be left with something like this. So the background actually comes forward as the foreground, and then you've got this nice green colour. So in the next layer, this green colour is going to be your next layer of leaves, but they will appear as though they are underneath this yellow layer. So all you need to do is get your stencils out, and this time it doesn't matter if it crosses over the other leaves that are already down, because you want to make it look as though the leaves are piled on top of one another. So it's very random. The only thing would be is don't draw onto the shapes you've already painted. So for example, I might put this leaf here, but I'll only draw into the green space, not into the yellow space of the leaves that are already there. So you're left with an outline. The green space on the inside of this stencil drawing is what you'll be left with, and we're going to paint the outside layer. So we're going to paint outside the line, and we're going to paint around the leaves that are already there, the yellow leaves. All will become clear. So you want to layer up your images. These ones can, like I say, it can cross over the top of the leaves that are already down, but don't cross them over the top of each other. So your stencil can cross the yellow line, but don't go across a green border, because that will make it far too complicated. And when you're putting your stencils down, make sure you switch them around a bit. Make sure that you might do some upside down, some back to front, just to give a little bit of variation and to make the leaves look more natural, as though they've naturally fallen. that way, and then use both your stencils. And again, you don't have to put the whole of the stencil on, you can just have parts of the stencil so it looks as though the leaves have just fallen off the page. Obviously, the more complicated your shape is, the more difficult this is going to be, but it also makes the design more attractive. It can do. So I think I'll put this one here. So once you've done that, you've got as many leaves down as you require. I think I might fit one more there. Natural leaf. And put this one here. Make sure it's not crossing over any other green leaves. And just draw around the outside. Again, you can draw freehand if you want to. You don't actually need a stencil, but it just makes things a bit easier. Right, so now you need to very carefully paint a slightly darker layer, just like you did with the yellow leaves. You're now going to create the green leaves by painting the negative space, the space on the outside of the stencils you've just drawn, and making sure you stay on the outside of the yellow leaves that you've created. We don't want to go over those. Those are going to be our top foreground layer, so we want to paint around those as well. So the green leaves will appear as though they are on the layer underneath the yellow leaves. So I'm going to start off by making a slightly darker green. So using the same colours that I did before, but I'm just not going to add the white this time. And it doesn't have to be variations of the same colour, it can be a different colour entirely. But I like to just build up slightly darker versions of the same colour to begin with, and then use a more contrasting colour later on. So I'll show you, for example, here we've got this yellow leaf we've painted, we've got this green leaf underneath with the stencil around, and then we've got the rest of our coloured paper. So I'm going to paint around the yellow leaf and around the stencil. So I'm actually painting the negative space around these two images. This is why you need to make sure that you can see your pencil marks enough so you know where you're painting and it doesn't get confusing. And there needs to be enough contrast between the colour that you're painting and the previous colour that you can tell that there's a difference. So I'm painting around my stenciled leaf, which is there, and around the yellow leaf. And here we've got another stencil shape coming in, so I'm going to paint around that. So what I would usually do is start off with a bigger brush, and then as the layers get more and more detailed, move to smaller and smaller brushes because the layers, the spaces in between where the negative space becomes apparent, it will become a smaller and smaller amount of space, so it might become a bit more fiddly. So I'm just going to carry on painting the rest of this, and I'll see you at the next level. So once that layer's done, you should be able to see that you've got your first layer is in the foreground, then it looks as though you've got the next layer underneath, and then you've got your darkest layer at the back. So you could leave it like this, but I'm going to add in another layer, and you're just basically doing exactly the same as you did before, making sure you avoid the first leaves and the second leaves you've created and the stencil shape, so it gets more complicated the further down you go. So you can do as many layers as you like depending on what you want the finished article to look like. So I'm going to add in another layer of leaves underneath now and paint around the negative space in a darker colour. So then you're left with something a bit like this, and you can, of course you can leave this here, but then what I like to do is just add an extra layer of interest by adding some outlines of the leaf shapes on top in a metallic pen, or sometimes I like to fill it in, do the opposite, fill in the inside of the shape, the positive space, in like metallic paint. But I'm going to do it with the pen this time, just to add a bit of interest to your picture. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, it's up to you. I just think it adds a bit of something to the design, and I am a big fan of a bit of glitter, a bit of sparkle, a bit of metallic gold. So I understand a lot of people don't like that kind of thing, but I think it's quite fun. So yeah, all I do is just use the stencils to draw some interesting leaf designs over the top of what we've done here. So that is what I'm left with there, and I'm pretty happy with that. So once you've got your design completed, you can then do what you want with it. So you can leave it as a finished painting, or you can use it as background papers for cards, for collages, and for other mixed media projects, which is what I'm going to do. So I'll see you in my next video. Bye.